This is Outrageous History. Welcome to Outrageous History. I'm Ernest Granson. In November of 1963, rifle shots rang out at the Dealey Plaza in downtown Dallas, taking the life of 46-year-old John F. Kennedy and cementing his image in the minds of Americans and people worldwide. Decades later, he still commands the interest of the public and continues to be a source of scrutiny. While Kennedy bounced around as a teenager and young man trying to find his place, it wasn't long before he found that place, both as a member of the House of Representatives and as a senator. During that time, he had built up enough political and media credibility to become nominated as Democratic candidate for president, defeating Republican Richard Nixon in 1960. Despite the fact the electoral vote was the closest in any presidential election since 1916, JFK and his team had already created a powerful and unique force. According to John Hellmann, professor of literature and film studies at Ohio State University, the Kennedy phenomenon had its origin in JFK's childhood and was propagated with the help of family, friends, advisors, and the media. John, who's authored many books and articles, says in his book, The Kennedy Obsession, The American Myth of JFK, that this American experience goes even deeper than that. John is here with us today. John, thanks very much for taking time to talk to us about the Kennedy obsession.
I really appreciate the opportunity.
So, John, you prefaced your book with a quote from Jacqueline Kennedy about a week after Kennedy's assassination. She said, "Jack's life had more to do with myth, legend, saga, and story than with political theory or political science." Does that sum up his relationship with the American and global public?
Yes, I think it does. And she went on in that interview to kind of follow up on that statement to say that you have to imagine Jack as a 10-year-old boy lying in bed, sick much of the time, in a family that was famously very active, reading the Knights of the Round Table, about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And then she proceeded to tell the journalist, Theodore White, that there'll be other presidential administrations, Mr. White, but there'll never be another Camelot, King Arthur's legendary kingdom. And, cynical journalists and historians over the next, I'd say, probably decade or even 2 decades, whenever they'd refer to Jacqueline Kennedy's comments, would do it dismissively, found it sentimental, etc. But the fact is that is stuck. And the administration that Kennedy himself had campaigned for under the slogan, "The New Frontier," in which the journalists during the time referred to as the New Frontier and referred to Kennedy and his cabinet members, et cetera, as New Frontiersmen, has long since, ever since, been referred to as Camelot. And so I think that right there gives you a sense of how Kennedy's fantasies, his dreams, and I think the seeds of his imagined self, even in his childhood, which in a lot of ways were kind of compensating for his frustrations at that time, wound up becoming what he projected upon the national screen, of the mass media, the important role of television, particularly by the time of his administration, and have lived on in the American imagination. And I'll just say one more thing while we're on the Camelot. Camelot, for Americans, I think is the lost future. That's the significance of it. It's like, the assassination, of course, was not obviously not part of Kennedy's plans or intentions, but because he had created such a vivid, heroic image of himself and of the potential of the American people, during the early 1960s. And then he was so abruptly, shockingly removed from the scene through this assassination. And then, of course, not long after American history spiraled down into the Vietnam War, quagmire, Watergate, all the things that in many ways continue today in the deep polarization of the United States. People tend to look back at this Kennedy period as in terms of what might have been. And, there's obviously a fantasy element to that, but it has a strong and vivid role, I think, in American identity and a sense of American history. And, when we think about where is this going?
So would you say that it was Kennedy's poor health as a boy and a young man is one of the main reasons why he actually formulated his view of heroes?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, his older, he was the second son, and the older brother, Joe Kennedy Jr., was absolutely the apple of both Rose Kennedy and Joseph Kennedy Sr.'s eye, the parents. And he was honestly everything they wanted their son to be. And he was athletic, he was daring, he was et cetera, et cetera. And so John F. Kennedy was not the apple of his mother's eye. She was often very, she wrote a memoir, and we have plenty of it right there in the memoirs. It comes through loud and clear that she was often annoyed with him. He was he was rebellious, et cetera. And he was resentful of her remoteness and even of her intense religiosity, and how she would take breaks from the family and go off for several weeks at a time on an extended cruise vacation to Europe, et cetera. So anyway, and he was repeatedly missing out on events and opportunities during his childhood, including his teen years, and this would actually even plague him later through mysterious illnesses. They were very mysterious in many ways, and so he developed. Maybe he would have had an inclination to reading anyway, but he certainly lived in reading for a considerable degree. And one of the things that's striking is that he fell in love with British literature and particularly British history, which, he's the son of an Irish Catholic American man who deeply resented the establishment in New England, who, were all descended from England. We all know the Irish, British tensions. And so it's striking right there that he found a kind of compensatory source of identification with a tradition that was kind of at odds with the way he was being brought up, within the family. But yeah, just to take that a little bit further, we know one of his early, when he would be asked, even after he got into politics, certainly friends have told us this when he was a young adult, before he got into politics. But even when he first got in politics, he would often say to friends that he would have liked to have been a writer, maybe be a writer. So his love of reading led towards an inclination and an aspiration to be a writer. And when his elder brother was tragically killed during World War II, then his father's eyes turned to Jack, for the political ambitions that Joseph Sr. had for the family. And there was considerable, concern about whether Jack would be able to have the kind of what they called in the Irish, Boston Irish politics, moxie, the kind of, would he be the kind of guy who could glad hand people and charm them and do all that? Because he was, more introspective and et cetera. But what turned out that he did have was an innate sense of drama. and a readiness to employ writers and other media to help him tell a story of himself. So I think, yeah, that was crucial.
Well, speaking of that, and speaking of his parents' relationship and his health, do you think that it was Kennedy's determination to take part in active combat, and consequently his actions during the PT boat incident, were they a result of his poor physical health or possibly inadequacies?
When you say that his health was involved in his wanting to be in the war, or what
right.
happened?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think absolutely. But it wasn't. I have to say, Joseph Kennedy Sr. despised war, and he did not want to. I'm talking about his father, and did not want to be in World War I. And he was dead set against the United States getting involved in World War II. And he wound up having a falling out with President Roosevelt over that. He was Roosevelt appointed him ambassador to Great Britain. But once Pearl Harbor happened, like virtually all Americans, the huge overwhelming number of Americans immediately, turned towards, well, we're in the war. We have to support the war. And both Joe Jr., Jack's elder brother, and Joe immediately, wanted to get in the war. And in Jack's case, though, his ill health actually threatened to keep him out of combat. And he actually managed to overcome the inclination of the military not to let him, be a commander of PT boats. And it appears that he managed to persuade his father to pull some influential strings in order to make that possible. But the point is, I think that it's a complicated thing, the motivation. To what degree Jack felt a special need to be in the war because his father had been branded an appeaser, during the debate over getting in the war. And he wanted to compensate for that. To what degree he wanted to get in the war because having spent his childhood and teenage years so often reading about heroes of British history. We know he was fascinated by Lawrence of Arabia, for instance, T.E. Lawrence, the British hero. Who could say for sure, but those were probably all influential. I think the really crucial thing to realize about his World War II heroism, though, that was so often has been overlooked by commentators and historians, is that the account of the sinking of his PT boat and his leadership of his crew in surviving, it was something like 11 days marooned, desperately trying not to be captured by the Japanese, not wind up starving to death, but trying to find rescue, is that John Hersey, who was a contemporary of Kennedy and knew Kennedy, that the account he wrote up for the New Yorker magazine that then got condensed in Reader's Digest was not really a conventional hero tale. It wasn't. Mm-hmm. It wasn't if you read it, it's not a tale of Jack Kennedy being some incredible war leader, or Audie Murphy, if you know the World War II combat hero. It's a tale of someone to whom something totally unexpected and disastrous happens right at the beginning. The cutting in half of the PT boat in the middle of the night by a Japanese destroyer and suddenly floating in the Pacific, with his crewmen. What it is a tale of the absolute intense determination and willing and risk-taking with which Kennedy spent, just to give you one example, during that period, an entire night, all but buck naked, swimming around the island they were marooned on, in the ocean, worrying about sharks, et cetera, worrying about, tidal currents and so on, and on until they just kept finding ways to endure, and they were suffering. And finally, they were rescued. And without getting the details of that, if you read this story, it reflects what John Hersey said was was a longtime thematic interest of his in all the writing he did, and particularly the writing he did about American soldiers in World War II, which was the suffering they had to endure, and getting people at home to experience through literary narrative what it was like to actually be a soldier, in this uncertainty. So I think right there, the Reader's Digest condensed version of this was wound up being virtually the entire basis of John F. Kennedy's first campaign for Congress. His father had, something like 40,000 off-prints of the article printed, and it was distributed all over the congressional district that Jack was running in. And if you look at Kennedy's campaign speeches during that run, he was clearly playing. I mean, this was 1946, so this was a time when, if you're a veteran, you're going to make references to what it's like now for all of us coming back from World War II, and now we're dealing with the uncertainty of trying to rebuild, start our lives again. And you see that Kennedy's original political image is not of some kind of commanding, no one could possibly beat him hero. It's of a kind of common man kind of image, but someone who's got pluck, who's got determination, who doesn't give up easily, and who has suffered and has come out of that suffering and is changed by it, humbled by it, and maybe matured by it. And I think those have just become important elements of the Kennedy image that will evolve all the way up to his presidency.
And speaking of writers, Ernest Hemingway was another figure that you believe greatly influenced Kennedy's journey towards his personal and public image. What was it about Hemingway that Kennedy attempted to emulate?
Well, Ernest Hemingway, during the period of John F. Kennedy's life, I mean, honestly, from, the time I'd say he was 10, 12 years old, all the way up to Hemingway's death very early in Kennedy's presidency, was an absolutely world famous figure. In the 1950s, he appeared on the cover of Life magazine 16 separate times. At that time, there was no greater badge of your celebrityhood than to be on the cover of Life magazine. That was an absolutely dominant kind of vehicle, it just had a huge circulation and was prominent on the newsstands. Excuse me. And, Ernest Hemingway was known for having been known for being in more than one war. And he was known for having been wounded, just as in World War I, just as, of course, Kennedy was wound up wounded, he was wounded in World War II in the sense that his back injury was exacerbated because of when the boat was his ship was cut in half. But above all, he was known for the ideal of what he called courage, defining courage as grace under pressure. And when Kennedy wrote his book of kind of popular biography, popular history called Profiles in Courage, published in 1956, and he got the Pulitzer Prize for history with that book, and it was a hugely important vehicle for his image in moving towards the presidency. He started the book with quoting Ernest Hemingway, his ideal of courage is great grace under pressure, and then he went on to suggest that he believed that ideal was exemplified in the political realm by the senators, the senators in American history that he was writing about in this book. And so I think, for Kennedy, as for so many men of his generation, Hemingway was a kind of model and articulator of a certain American ideal, 20th century American ideal of manhood, of masculinity. And I think, Kennedy adopted elements of that, particularly the idea of showing grace under pressure. And I'll just say one more thing on that at the moment. I think one of the things Americans look back at when they think of for instance, the Cuban Missile Crisis, is that Kennedy took us through that, exhibiting grace under intense pressure. And, we're talking about someone who was in his early 40s, with the fate of the world and the balance. And so, I think it remains rather inspirational.
There was another point in that Hemingway chapter in your book. You pointed out an assertion that Kennedy made in the book. He was profiling individual senators, and then he wrote that each one's need to maintain his own respect for himself was more important to him than his popularity with others, because his desire to win or maintain a reputation for integrity and courage was stronger than his desire to maintain his office, and because his faith that his course was the best one would ultimately be vindicated, outweighing his fear of public reprisal. What was that a major theme that to which Kennedy wanted to identify?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, I'm really glad that you focused on that, saw the significance of that in there, because that was really one of the major things I wanted to accomplish in that chapter. Yeah, again, there have been, a lot of people are kind of anti-Kennedy. They certainly were, commentators in that. There's been a whole literature of kind of anti-Kennedy revisionism, especially back, I say, in the 70s and 80s and 90s. That there was a lot of that, and they'd often just dismiss this as just another, campaign style book, the kind of, just a production to promote his image, and that the only reason it got the attention it did and gave the reputation it did was that his father was able to manipulate his connections behind the scenes and getting the prize, et cetera, et cetera. And that is, I think that is just incredibly simplistic and just plain wrong. No, you're right. I think that's very revealing. This was not a typical campaign book. And in fact, because of the very theme that you're focusing on, this could have been a lot of people would not have, a lot of politicians would, and I'd say most politicians with ambitions would not have dared write a book with this theme. In effect, it was telling readers that if you vote for me, in a future run for national office, you're getting someone who may turn around and defy you one day, and who cares more about his own conviction of what is right than about what you elected him, you think, to do. And in doing that, it reveals a kind of tension in democracy, and maybe particularly in American democracy, where there's always been such an emphasis in American culture with our frontier past and our immigrant past on individualism, kind of rugged individualism. So there's always been a tension between democracy, which kind of celebrates the majority. It's certainly, in the mass, and the idea of the individual. And Kennedy, when you read the introductory chapters of the book, where he sets forth his philosophy, he certainly doesn't come down completely on one side or the other. He realizes that this is a delicate balance, and in fact, that he says straight out, anybody is not going to easily defy their union or their corporate bosses over what they think is right, if it's going to mean I'm not going to be able to make a living, support my family, I'm not going to be able to, move up, or et cetera, et cetera. And politicians are no different than that, So he's not saying the people I'm going to celebrate in this book, or what I think the way it should be, is just some sort of wild person who does whatever they just ignored their the people who put them there and the people who have expectations. But what he does say is there may come a moment in one's life or career, as it certainly did for the senators that he's going to devote separate chapters to, where you may feel this is a very serious, fateful decision put before you, where your own real belief in yourself, your own sense of what is right and the importance of it. And also, and I think this is telling with Kennedy's childhood reading, and your sense of what history will say, not just the people right now, but what history will say. You may decide to put that first, that you need to put that first, whatever the cost. So yeah, I think that was really the fundamental theme of that book. And I can't remember at the moment, I can't remember the precise man, but I remember it was a friend of Kennedy's, or a friend of a friend or whatever, who when he read the book, I think he was given a copy, whatever, right at the beginning, and he read the book. He recorded in his diary, "This is a dangerous book." He seemed to have doubts about whether someone who would write a book like this, really should be president. He saw that theme and was somewhat, wondered what the implications of that really were.
Well, somebody that was involved with the book, and that was Theodore Sorensen. He was a crucial individual in Kennedy's life. Kennedy originally hired him as a researcher, and he eventually became the primary speechwriter. And even more so, he served as special advisor. And there were some of those who spent time in the White House called Sorensen JFK's intellectual alter ego. What do you feel was Sorensen's influence in creating the Kennedy myth?
Oh, I think it was very important, and I think it played a huge role in, the Kennedy. I'm careful with the word myth. I think it played a huge role in the development of Kennedy's image over the course of the 1950s and into the presidency, because Sorensen and Kennedy had very different backgrounds, but they intellectually hit it off. And he never socialized with Theodore Sorensen. They were very different in so many ways, but intellectually they hit it off. And the two of them together over the course of the 1950s produced a very large series of articles that appeared in a wide assortment of magazines in the country. And these range from the rather elite, the Foreign Affairs, a journal that's read by more by the elite, the Foreign Affairs mind, all the way to magazines like Saturday Evening Post, et cetera, a wide range. And, Sorensen was playing he was like the main drafter of these, but they were being written in collaboration. I mean, Kennedy wasn't, they were appearing under Kennedy's name. He was the person authorizing it. And if he was not the original drafter typically of these, he was certainly the person who would talk with Sorensen, and they'd work out what he wanted to say in this article. And then he might make, from that, Sorensen would, maybe be working from notes, et cetera. But then, of course, Kennedy would I'm sure always read what Sorensen had written, and want things taken out or reworded or whatever. And this goes all the way up through the inaugural address, et cetera, and the profiles in courage. They played a role. It was a collaboration, and I think if it's if the best evidence would seem to tell us that Sorensen probably was the chief. I don't want to have this misunderstood. In many ways, he was the chief writer, the chief wordsmith. But Kennedy was the collaborator, the decision maker, and the one who was going to take the responsibility for what was in there. And of course, when you're talking about speeches, he was the one who was going to perform it. Speak it and perform it. And, of course, that all culminates in the inaugural address, which I think it's fair to say has become one of the sacred texts of, what you would say, like the American civil religion, kind of, we think of the Declaration of Independence. We think of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address.
Right.
An inaugural address. We think of Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. But I think Kennedy's inaugural address is right up there with those. And, no one's ever been able to completely pull apart exactly what is from Sorensen and what from Kennedy in terms of it originated. I can tell you it's a complicated story. A lot of suggestions were solicited and came in from all sorts of sources that some of it worked its way in and some of it not. And let me just say, we know that, the most famous lines of that speech, to give you an example of what we're talking about here, the most famous lines of that speech are, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And we know that when we've now turned up that when biographers have, that when John F. Kennedy was in prep school at Choate, this prep school, and as a teenager, that the head of that school gave a talk to them where he said, ask not what Choate can do for you, ask what you can do for Choate. So, I mean, so obviously, I mean, the evidence is strong, and you can find before Sorensen came on the scene and working for Kennedy, going back to Kennedy's time working in the House of Representatives, we can find speeches by Kennedy where some of these fundamental sentiments that echo, that we reappear in his speeches later, were already appearing. So what I want to emphasize is that Sorensen and many others, played a role in Kennedy's intellectual development, his political development, and Sorensen more than any others, I think, in his kind of characteristic, writing style and speaking style. But, at the end of the day, Kennedy, I think, was, you could say the director and the performer of these words.
Well, so while his public presence received this significant boost during the 1940s and say the early 1950s with the help of the print media, it was through the media of television and film in the later 1950s that really propelled his image to a higher level. And as you say in your book, never appearing in an actual film, but rather turning the television apparatus into his screen, he became the greatest movie star of the 20th century. How did he manage this?
Well, I absolutely stand by that idea that I do think he became the greatest movie star of the 20th century. And in fact, I want to quote his father, as I do in the book, in a book written by a couple of journalists in 1960, while the campaign was still underway. A couple of journalists interviewed his father, and they pointed out that Kennedy was the only candidate who was actually running as a celebrity, instead of on the basis of political experience and or experience in business or whatever. Excuse me. And his father really made no bones about this. His father said, "Why is it that when Jack's photo appears on the cover of Life magazine, it sells more copies than if a photo of Jimmy Stewart appears on it or a photo of Cary Grant appears on it?" And they were the two, major Hollywood male stars of that era. And he said, "I'll tell you why." He answered it himself. It's because he's got more universal appeal. And if we go back to the 1940s, before he ran his first congressional campaign, and this continued all through his years as a congressperson and senator, Kennedy was able to go out to Los Angeles, Hollywood, and mix with Hollywood stars, and get to know them. And the reason he was able to do this was his father had actually worked for 5 years back in, I think it was late 1920s, as a Hollywood producer. He actually did. And he actually took over the career of Gloria Swanson, who was the biggest, female star of the day. And so with those connections, and with of course all the ways wealth works for one, and the fact that Kennedy was an attractive young man, he was able to mix in that world, and he got to know them. And we have testimony from some of his closest friends of that era that in private conversations, that he would talk a lot to the friend, asking aloud, what is it these stars have? What is it that a Jimmy Stewart has? What is it a Spencer Tracy has that makes people identify with them and like them, etc. And so I think the evidence is strong that Kennedy both kind of modeled himself on some of his favorite stars, but also had worked at figuring out sort of tricks of performance for the screen, and that he then was able to bring that to television. And he famously commented to some aides right after he won the election, when they were watching TV. He said, we never would have been able to pull this off without that gadget. So he knew the power of TV. And you mentioned how he also used movies. He wasn't in a movie himself. Well, sort of was not, because I want to say what he was very open to do was a young filmmaker. I think it's Pennebaker, who a documentary filmmaker, wanted to do a new approach to documentary that's become known as direct cinema, where you wouldn't have a sort of voice of God narrator, and that's the way documentaries had been done. Instead, you would basically just get access to your subject, and you would just let the camera roll, and you wouldn't rely on narration, and you would try to keep filming this, that you would hope that to some degree your subjects would sort of have to forget you or ignore you and just go on. And when he was approached by this documentary filmmaker, Kennedy opened the White House to him for certain things, for certain episodes. So there actually the first example of this was actually during the Wisconsin primary, and it's about a 45-minute documentary where the stars are John F. Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey. That was his major opponent in the Wisconsin primary. But then after Kennedy got elected, during one of the major civil rights crises, again, the filmmaker was allowed into the White House, and it's now a documentary. It became a documentary film known as Crisis. And, these were shown on TV. We still have them. This part of what, kind of keeps the Kennedy mystique alive is just one element, is that we are able to get these kind of compelling, to a considerable degree, real life looks at him, in action.
Well, so far we've been talking about what you would call, let's say, the techniques or the processes that were used to create that JFK image. But in your book, you also emphasized that it's just as important to realize why the techniques worked, and that is because the JFK image appealed to the viewers or listeners' shared fantasies of the man. Can you elaborate a bit about that?
Yeah, most definitely. You know, I would say, well, start with the slogan that he introduced during his acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention in 1960. The Democratic Convention that year was in Los Angeles, which is, of course, on the westernmost, coast of the continental United States. And he said at one point, and I think it's a pretty close paraphrase, he said, I look out tonight upon, what was once the end of the American frontier. And he said, and there are those who will tell you that the frontiers now are all over. They're all gone. They're closed. But I'm here to tell you tonight that the frontiers are not over. There are new frontiers. There are new challenges. And then he started listing them, and he talked about the challenge of standing up for freedom against the totalitarian Soviet Union, the challenge of maintaining peace during this Cold War, the challenge of civil rights, and he named a number of other kind of domestic challenges. And he said, I'm not running for president telling you what I'm going to give you. I'm not running with promises. I'm running for president telling what challenges I'm going to give you, what I'm going to ask of you. And, here he is in 1960, which is the absolute pinnacle of the popularity of Western movies and television shows. They had been extremely popular, particularly the movies, all through the 1950s, dominated the Hollywood screen. And, these tales of American ancestors in the Old West, and then they were very popular on television then. And so right at this moment, he's saying to the American public, you're reading books right now that are worrying that Americans have become conformist. They're just like, men in gray flannel suits doing their corporate jobs, and that they've become complacent because of the American post-World War II affluence, et cetera. And he's saying, no, we now have the opportunity, maybe even the duty, to seek out new challenges, new versions of the frontier that are all around us. And in effect, he stood there as someone who was like a star of a Western in a movie, saying, with this heroic stance that I'm willing to be the one who goes out there and meets, confronts danger. As a source of identification for his audience. And then if you look at one of the things that this day is most part of his legacy is that he creates the Peace Corps, which gives an opportunity to young Americans to try to put their idealism into action, around the world. So I think again, we're living in an era right now when obviously there's a lot of revisionism going on about American history, and for good reason, and we talk about the Western, we know, the Western was not putting on the screen, certainly not foregrounding it very often in the 1950s, so many of the realities of what was going on in Americans' expansion, into the world of the lands held by the Native Americans. So that's just one example there. Right now we're in an era when I think quite correctly, we are having a reckoning with the darker aspects of our past. But that leaves open the issue of, well, how are we going to keep the best from our past? And as we try to deal with acknowledging the worst. And I think Kennedy stands there for us as an image of someone who was willing, who identified strongly with the best in the United States and encouraged Americans to act on on the best. And, and one more element, during the course of his brief presidency, he did evolve. He evolved on the issue of civil rights. He evolved on the issue of the Cold War. And he wound up identifying himself during the last year of his presidency, 1963, with, in both those realms, with stances that he had either not, that he had not forefronted earlier. He had not acted on. So in a very real way, he did do what he had, in a sense, projected for himself in the book Profiles in Courage. And I'm talking about, in the terms of civil rights, at first he thought he was elected president by the American people, above all, to fight the Cold War. And when the freedom rides began, the other kinds of disruptions or confrontations by the civil rights workers in the South against segregated facilities, Kennedy at first was trying to encourage the leaders to be cautious. He was afraid this was just making America look bad in the third world countries. That's what they were called at the time, that he saw as the battleground with the Soviet Union. But the civil rights movement, they were determined to be assertive. And as this began to boil, and of course, the white Southern white supremacist side got very strongly resisted. And so when this boiled up into an absolute crisis, Kennedy called for free airtime as president, and he made a dramatic appearance on the three networks. Remember, that's all there was then, three networks.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And then live gave a speech where he, in effect, completely adopted the point of view of a James Baldwin and a Martin Luther King. And he told the American people, he asked the American people to ask themselves how they could claim to be the land of the free if a very large member of their public was going to be of their fellow Americans was going to be an exception. And he very strongly came down on that. And this stands in history as the first time a president of the United States actually presented the American people with civil rights as a moral issue. That had not, President Eisenhower enforced the Supreme Court orders, but he never went to the American people and said, I agree with them, and it's a moral issue. And then in terms of the Cold War, in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was absolutely appalled at how close we had come to World War III. And so he became determined to try to work out with Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, a nuclear test ban treaty, and to begin lowering the temperature of the Cold War confrontation. And he had great opposition there and in the United States, and particularly Edward Teller, who was like the father of the hydrogen bomb, was a leading public, outspoken opponent of what Kennedy was doing. But Kennedy persisted, and he worked hard at this in public. And he gave a speech at American University. And I think both these speeches I'm talking about, the one on TV and then this speech, I think both happened pretty much around late summer '63, towards the end, in which he adopted the language such as, whether you're communist in the Soviet Union or whether you're a capitalist and a Democrat in the United States, we all breathe the same air. We all have children, et cetera, et cetera. And, to the end of his days, Theodore Sorensen said that he considered that Kennedy's greatest speech, not the inaugural address.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that gives you some sense of how Kennedy both spoke in terms and images and within a kind of historical and also kind of mythic self-awareness that resonated with the American public. But he also helped evolve within that and kind of suggest to Americans how they could evolve and how they thought of their historical direction.
So just one final question here, and that is, given the landscape of social platforms and other media that exists today, could this type of image be created again, but especially on the scale that occurred with Kennedy?
Wow, that would certainly, there are often, again, those commentators who say it could not be done today. And I would certainly agree with them that many of the things that Kennedy had going for him in the 1950s and early 60s would not be so would not work today. And that is the fact we only had 2 and then 3 television broadcast networks. And you certainly did not have this 24-hour news cycle, et cetera. And you certainly have a much more skeptical and hostile media now, et cetera, than you had then. And another thing, Kennedy's private life, there were elements that the public would not have liked if they had known about it. And at that time, the press practiced what they considered a gentleman's agreement. You didn't report about the private lives of politicians unless that somehow it had managed to, by happenstance, it just gotten out, something that happened in public. So he was really quite protected that way, in a way politicians certainly are not today, and have not been ever since Gary Hart's run for the presidency in the late 1980s, I think. But I would not say that precludes that this kind of thing could be done today. We are in it would take maybe somewhat different talents, and it would certainly have to take some different calculations. But I would not I think whatever your politics, one can see that there has been a phenomenon in recent years of a political figure able to get a kind of commanding presence, across the internet. Yeah,
that's right.
And it's probably no accident that whereas Kennedy was someone who was deeply attuned to the power of writing in the era of the mass circulation magazines, and deeply attuned to Hollywood in the era that TV came in. And then Ronald Reagan became president in the 1980s when TV had gained an absolutely commanding presence, and he was a former movie star. I think it's probably very telling that probably the nearest thing to someone gaining such a commanding presence through the media in our 21st century era was a former reality television star. So
it all makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, interesting comparison between then and now. So, John, I really thank you for your insight into this important facet of politics and culture, and thank you so much for joining us today.
You asked great questions. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you, John. And I thank all of you for tuning in today. We'll see you again soon. Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.